By the summer of 1944, the Allied High Command was facing a concrete nightmare. Along the coast of occupied France, the Nazis had constructed mimoyeks, massive, reinforced bunkers housing the V-1 and V-2 rockets, the vengeance weapons aimed directly at the heart of London. Standard bombing runs were useless. Hundreds of tons of conventional explosives had bounced off these bunkers like pebbles. To crack them, the Allies didn't need a better bomber. They needed a meteor. The solution was Project Aphrodite, an operation so dangerous and experimental that it felt more like a suicide pact than a military strategy. The plan was as simple as it was terrifying. Take a battle-worn B-17 Flying Fortress, strip out every ounce of non-essential weight, the guns, the armor, the seats, and pack the hollowed-out fuselage with 30,000 pounds of Torpex. Torpex was 50% more powerful than TNT. It was a high-explosive cocktail designed to pulverize U-boats, and Project Aphrodite was packing 10 tons of it into a single airframe. The result was a robot death plane, a flying bomb that turned a legendary bomber into a volatile, temperamental weapon of mass destruction. But there was a catch. The remote control technology of 1944 was primitive. The mothership could guide the drone via radio once it was in the air, but the B-17 couldn't take off on its own. A human crew, a pilot and a flight engineer, had to manually fly this 10-ton bomb into the sky, climb to a specific altitude, and arm the complex explosive triggers. Only then, once the plane was stabilized and heading toward the English Channel, were they supposed to jump out. If everything went perfectly, the pilot and engineer would bail out over the English coast, and a nearby mother plane would take over the radio controls, steering the pilotless B-17 into the heart of a Nazi bunker across the sea. But in the high-stakes theater of World War II, perfectly was a rare occurrence. Project Aphrodite was an operation where the smallest electrical spark or a single stray bullet didn't just mean a crash, it meant an explosion that could be seen from space. It was the birth of remote warfare, fueled by raw explosives and the lives of those brave enough to sit on top of them. The technology behind Project Aphrodite was a desperate mashup of cutting-edge radio science and raw, mechanical grit. The Allies were essentially trying to build a modern cruise missile using 1940s vacuum tubes and hydraulic levers. Because the radio control systems were so temperamental, the U.S. Army Air Forces needed more than just skilled aviators. They needed pilots with a specific kind of fearlessness, men who were willing to sit in a cockpit surrounded by 30,000 pounds of unstable Torpex, knowing that a single radio interference could turn their escape hatch into a tomb. The most famous volunteer for this robot service was Lieutenant Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. in 1944. Joe Jr. wasn't just another pilot. He was the golden son of the Kennedy dynasty. His father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., had spent years grooming Joe to be the first Catholic president of the United States. While his younger brother, Jack, the future JFK, was making headlines for his survival in the PT-109 incident in the Pacific, Joe Jr. felt a crushing pressure to distinguish himself. He had already completed his required combat missions, but when he heard about a secret, high-risk mission that could end the V-weapon threat forever, he didn't just volunteer. He insisted on flying. Joe Kennedy Jr. was the quintessential alpha. He was charismatic, athletic, and fiercely competitive. To him, Project Aphrodite wasn't a suicide mission, it was the ultimate opportunity to secure the military glory necessary for his future political ascension. He was paired with Wilford "Bud" Willey, a specialized flight engineer who knew the intricacies of the explosive triggers better than anyone. Together, they formed a crew that represented the absolute pinnacle of American ambition and technical expertise. The atmosphere at their base in Fursfield, England, was one of extreme secrecy. The Aphrodite planes were kept in isolated hangars, far from the standard bomber wings, to prevent a single accidental explosion from wiping out the entire base. The men who worked on these planes were sworn to silence, living in a world of flying bombs and remote control motherships. Kennedy and Willey spent weeks practicing the delicate transition, the moment where they would hand over control of the drone to the following aircraft, arm the fuses, and bail out into the freezing English air. Joe Sr. watched from afar, convinced his son was about to become the hero of the European theater. But as the mission date approached, the technical failures of the radio systems began to mount. The robot death planes were proving to be just as dangerous to their own pilots as they were to the enemy. Kennedy was confident he could beat the odds, but he was flying against a technology that was still in its infancy, and a weapon that didn't care about political dynasties. On the evening of August 12, 1944, Joe Kennedy Jr. and Bud Willie climbed into the cockpit of a B-17 that had been stripped of its soul and filled with its death. The aircraft, nicknamed the Robot, was carrying 21,170 pounds of Torpex and 600 pounds of liquid explosive. It was, quite literally, the most dangerous object in the British Isles. The plan was a choreographed dance of high-altitude terror. They would take off from Furze Field, fly toward the coast, arm the detonators, and then bail out over the village of Blythburgh. A mothership, flying safely behind them, would then radio steer the bomber across the channel and into a Nazi V-3 supergun site. The takeoff went smoothly. The massive bomber groaned under the weight of the explosives, but it reached its cruising altitude. 2 mother planes and a fleet of P-51 Mustangs trailed behind, watching the silver drone like hawks. At 6:20 p.m., Kennedy radioed the code word, "Spade Flush," indicating that the first stage of the arming process was complete. He was minutes away from the jump that would save his life and solidify his legend. Then, the sky turned white. Without warning, and before Kennedy or Willie could move toward the open hatch, the B-17 vanished. There was no smoke, no mechanical failure, and no enemy fire. In a microsecond, the 10 tons of Torpex detonated in a massive, blinding sphere of fire. The explosion was so powerful that it didn't just break the plane, it vaporized it. The following aircraft were nearly knocked out of the sky by the shockwave. One pilot described the sensation as if a giant hand had slammed into his cockpit. Below the blast, the quiet village of Blythburgh was rocked by what felt like a direct hit from a meteor. The shockwave shattered windows for miles, blew doors off hinges, and leveled trees. Debris from the Robot rained down over the Suffolk countryside. Jagged shards of aluminum and scorched engine parts fell into the marshes and onto the roofs of ancient cottages. There was nothing to recover. Joe Kennedy Jr. and Bud Willie were gone, silenced by the very technology that was supposed to make war safer for the pilots. The blast was so intense that some witnesses believed a secret Nazi wonder weapon had struck England. In reality, it was a catastrophic failure of the American Robot system. A stray electrical signal or a faulty solenoid had likely triggered the detonators prematurely. In an instant, the golden sun of the Kennedy family had been erased from the air, and the village of Blythburgh was left to pick up the pieces of a top-secret disaster they weren't even supposed to know existed. The death of Joe Kennedy Jr. wasn't just a personal tragedy for a powerful family, it was a devastating indictment of Project Aphrodite. The explosion over Blythburgh had sent a shockwave through the Allied command that was as political as it was physical. High-ranking generals and technical advisors were forced to face a cold, hard truth. They were trying to fight a high-tech war with low-tech tools. The Robot death planes were proving to be a greater threat to the British countryside and American pilots than they were to the Nazi V-weapon sites. The crisis within the project was one of reliability. The radio link technology, the primitive ancestor of modern Wi-Fi and satellite control, was plagued by atmospheric interference and crosstalk. During test flights, some drones would suddenly ignore their mother ships and enter steep, unrecoverable dives. Others would simply fly in circles until they ran out of fuel, drifting aimlessly like 30,000-pound ghosts over the English Channel. Despite the loss of Kennedy and the mounting failures, the military pushed forward in a desperate attempt to justify the massive investment. They switched from the B-17 to the PB-4Y-1 Liberator, hoping the different airframe would handle the volatile Torpex better. But the results were catastrophic. In mission after mission, the drones missed their targets by miles. In one instance, a drone lost its radio link and circled back toward England, nearly crashing into the very base it had just departed. The pilots bailing out were often injured or killed in the jump, and the precision promised by the engineers turned out to be a deadly illusion. The Navy and Army Air Forces began to point fingers. Was it a mechanical flaw? Was it the unstable nature of Torpex? Or was the entire concept of remote warfare simply impossible for the 1940s? The project reached its breaking point when it became clear that out of every drone launched, not one had successfully struck its intended bunker. The Nazis, meanwhile, were laughing off the Robot threat, as most Aphrodite planes ended up exploding harmlessly in the French mud or sinking into the sea. The crisis was no longer about winning the war, it was about stopping the bleeding. The military was pouring its brightest minds and its most famous sons into a furnace. The robot death planes had become a PR nightmare and a technical dead end. The dream of a bloodless war through remote control had turned into a series of expensive, high-altitude funerals. The revolution had failed, and the project was now standing on the edge of total abandonment, leaving the Kennedy family to mourn a son whose mission was scrubbed from the history books to hide the magnitude of the failure. By early 1945, the high command of the Allied forces had seen enough. Project Aphrodite, once hailed as the silver bullet that would decapitate the Nazi rocket program, was officially categorized as a total tactical disaster. The numbers were staggering in their futility. Out of 14 major Aphrodite missions launched against German targets, not a single drone successfully hit its mark. Most had been shot down by intense flak, suffered catastrophic radio failure, or simply plummeted into the sea due to technical glitches. The project's final success rate was effectively zero. In one of the final attempts to salvage the operation, a drone was guided toward the U-boat pens at Heligoland. Instead of striking the massive concrete bunkers, the radio link snapped at the critical moment, and the B-17 veered wildly off course, exploding harmlessly in a salt marsh miles away from the target. The robot death planes had become an expensive, lethal joke that the Nazis didn't even need to fight. They just had to wait for the Allied technology to destroy itself. In January 1945, General Karl Spaatz issued the order to shut down Aphrodite for good. The remaining drone airframes were quietly scrapped or returned to standard service, and the specialized radio equipment was packed away in unmarked crates. The project was classified top secret, not to protect a revolutionary new weapon, but to bury the embarrassment of its failure. The military didn't want the public to know that they had spent millions of dollars and lost some of their most promising aviators on a weapon that was more dangerous to the British countryside than to the German front lines. For the Kennedy family, the resolution was even more hollow. The official report on Joe Jr.'s death was vague, citing a mid-air explosion during a special mission. The true nature of the Aphrodite program, and the fact that the plane had likely vaporized because of a faulty solenoid, was kept from the headlines for years. Joe Sr.'s dreams of a political dynasty were shattered in an instant, forcing him to shift his titanic ambitions onto his second son, Jack. The project ended not with a bang of victory, but with the hiss of a dying fuse. The robot death planes were pushed into the shadows of history, labeled as a technological overreach. The Allies realized that if they wanted to destroy the V-2 sites, they couldn't rely on temperamental robots. They had to do it the old-fashioned way, with boots on the ground and massive, conventional carpet bombing. Aphrodite was dead, leaving behind nothing but scorched craters in the Suffolk marshes and a missing seat at the Kennedy dinner table. The smoke from Project Aphrodite eventually cleared, but its ghost has never truly left the battlefield. While the mission was a tactical failure, it was a prophetic success. Those temperamental B-17s, packed with high explosives and steered by shaky radio signals, were the clumsy, violent ancestors of the modern cruise missile and the Predator drone. Every precision strike executed in the 21st century carries the DNA of that disastrous experiment in the skies over Suffolk. The legacy of Aphrodite is a study in military overreach, the dangerous gap between a visionary idea and the technology required to make it safe. Charles Zimmerman had his pancake, and the U.S. Army Air Forces had their robot. Both proved that in 1944, the American military was willing to leap into the future, even if it meant falling flat on its face. The project taught the Pentagon a hard lesson. Remote warfare requires more than just raw power. It requires a level of digital reliability that the vacuum tube era simply couldn't provide. Politically, the legacy of the robot death planes reshaped the face of the American century. The explosion that vaporized Joe Kennedy Jr. fundamentally altered the course of the Kennedy dynasty. Had Project Aphrodite succeeded, or had Joe Jr. never volunteered, the name JFK might have remained a footnote in a history book dedicated to his older brother's presidency. The failure of a radio solenoid in AB-17 didn't just kill a pilot. It shifted the gravity of American politics, launching a younger brother toward a destiny he was never supposed to have. Today, if you visit the quiet village of Blythburgh, you can still find traces of that night in 1944. There are small memorials and local stories of the night the sky caught fire, but for the most part, Project Aphrodite remains a footnote in World War II history. It is a grim reminder of the cost of innovation, A story of men who sat on top of 10 tons of dynamite to test a future they would never live to see. It serves as the ultimate, cautionary tale. It warns us that technology is never just a tool. It is a gamble. In the push to make war bloodless through remote control, we often end up spilling blood in ways we never anticipated. Project Aphrodite was a bridge to the modern age, built out of fire and failure, crossing over the bodies of those who were brave enough to be the first digital soldiers in a mechanical world.